So chapter 3 will be on measurements. So if you have a bunch of numbers in your data set, we want to be able to consolidate all those numbers into one single number, where that single number describes something meaningful about the data set. So the first meaningful thing we want to talk about the data set is the center. In other words, if I give you guys a test and I look at all the test grades, I want to be able to have some sense of what the center grade is, or in other words, what the most typical grade is. So if I look at all the class grades, how do you think, what are some ways where we can determine how the typical students do?
By getting the median?
Yeah, very good. One way is the median, which we'll talk about later, but let's talk about one of the other ones first. Yeah. Yeah, the mean or the average. So it turns out that the mean is the same thing as the average. And how do you calculate the mean or the average? Yeah.
You add all the tests together and divide it by the amount of tests.
Yeah, very good. So you just add up all the numbers and divide by the number of numbers. So this is equal to the total, divide by the number of data points. Okay, so remember, even on the very first day of the semester, we made a big stink out of the difference between a population and a sample. So moving forward, any number, any measurement we talk about, we'll make a distinction between a population measurement and a sample measurement. So here in the case of the mean or the average, we'll talk about so I'm just going to say mean. So let's talk about the population mean. And the sample mean. So first of all, each of these are going to have a different symbol associated with them. So the population mean will be indicated with this symbol. This is the Greek letter mu. It looks like a fancy M or a fancy U, depending on how you look at it. I think it looks more like a fancy M. But it also looks like a fancy U because it looks like a U with a long tail out in front. So it looks like also a fancy U. The sample mean is given by this symbol, X with a bar over it. And so the population mean is read as mu. The sample mean is read as, not so creatively, X bar. Any questions? Okay, and whichever one of these you use depends on the context. So regardless, the way that you find the mean is you take the numbers in your data set, you add them up and you divide by the number of numbers. If your data set represents a population, which is all the numbers you care about, then the average or the mean of that data set would represent a population mean. So if your data set represents a sample, which is only a subset of all the numbers that you care about, then if you're to take the average of those group of numbers, then that would represent a sample mean. So the way that you calculate the mean in both cases is exactly the same. Add everything up and divide by the number of numbers. But specifically, whether it's a population mean or a sample mean depends on the context. If your numbers represent a population, then that mean is a population mean. If your numbers represent a sample, then that mean would be a sample. Any questions? All right. So let's basically, so in this class, you're not expected to memorize formulas. In this class on exams, you're given at least a formula sheet, but the formulas are expressed in standard notation, where you have to understand what the symbols mean. So let's say that our group of numbers represents a population. So we know that to find the mean, you just add up all the numbers and divide by the number of numbers. So in math, adding things up is given by this symbol. So this is the Greek letter for capital sigma. I won't write it down because that implies that you need to know that. So this is just the letter sigma, which represents summation. So this represents that you're going to add everything up to the right of that symbol. And so for the mean, we said you calculate it by adding up all the numbers. So we're going to add up each number in our population. And each number in the population is given by this capital X. So each number in population and each number in our population is going to be subject to being added together. So this summation symbol means you add up all the numbers together. So this is summation. So we want to add up every data point in our population, and then we want to divide by the number of numbers. So the number of numbers is going to be given by this symbol, capital N, which stands for population size. So this is just a compact, exact way to communicate this idea of the population mean, which is to add up all the numbers in your population and divide by the number of numbers. Any questions? So let's talk about the analog with the sample mean. So the way that you calculate the sample mean x bar means that if you're given a group of numbers that represents a sample, which is a subset of all the numbers you would care about, to calculate the mean for that sample would mean that you want to add up all the numbers in that sample, which again is this summation symbol, adding up. And so adding up all the numbers in our sample would be adding up all the lowercase x's. So lowercase x here would be each number in the sample. And then divide by lowercase n, that represents the sample size instead of the population size. Any questions? Okay, so long story short, the average of the mean is always found by adding up all the numbers and dividing by the number of numbers. Which of these two you actually use depends on the context of what your data set actually represents. If your data set represents a population, which is all the numbers you care about, then when you find the average of those numbers, you're finding a population mean. If your data set represents a sample, which is only a subset of all the numbers you care about, then when you find the mean of that data set that represents a sample, then you're finding a sample mean. Okay, yeah.
So, and then the question is the same for each one?
Yeah, the question would be the same. The question would be find the population mean for these numbers, or find the sample mean for these numbers. And in both cases, you would just add up all the numbers and divide by the number of numbers. But mathematically, we make the distinction, and the symbols are different, but conceptually, you're doing the same thing. Yeah. But if you see this on a formula sheet, for example, then you know what each of these symbols